This is a homily for the fifth Sunday of Easter. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 14, verses 1 to 12. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. In his book, A Brief History of Time, the late Stephen Hawking makes an observation and then poses some questions. He writes, "We find ourselves in a bewildering world. We want to make sense of what we see around us and to ask, what is the nature of the universe? What is our place in it? And where did it and we come from? Why is it the way it is?" When the French philosopher Gabriel Marcel encountered such questions, he made a helpful distinction between problem and mystery. To understand that distinction, we need first to ask what he means by problem. Marcel says this: "Whenever a problem is found, I am working upon data placed before me." In other words, problems can be subjected to empirical verification and scientific testing. A problem can be analysed, broken down, and worked on from the outside. For every problem, there is a solution, and once solved, it's finished. Consider these examples: a mechanic repairing an engine, a computer programmer tracking down an error in the system, a student struggling with a mathematical problem, a scientist seeking an antidote for a virus, a person challenged by a crossword puzzle, someone absorbed in a whodunit. In all of those cases, time and experience will eventually yield an answer. A problem may totally absorb us, at least for a while, but we are capable of stepping back from it and getting on with something else. A mystery, however, is not simply a more complicated problem. Mystery describes questions that engage us at a more profound level of our being. In a mystery, we ourselves are involved. These are questions that we cannot put to one side because we are part of what is being questioned. We are actors, not detached spectators in the theatre of mystery. So, for example, I may ask, does my life have any ultimate meaning? Does God exist? Is there life after death? Why is there suffering and evil? How do I decide what's right and what's wrong? We respond to questions such as these by adopting a worldview, a story, a decoder, or a meta-narrative, something that helps us understand why things are the way they are. In other words, it is a lens through which we interpret everything, or the self-narrative that we use to make sense of the world around us. One way of putting this is that we adopt a religion in the very broad sense of the word. Etymologically, our English word religion comes from the Latin religare, which means to tie back. So, for example, when we plant a sapling, we want it to grow tall and straight, so we tie it back to a stake in the ground. By way of analogy, the stake to which we bind the sapling is our worldview, our story, decoder, or meta-narrative. One of the basic premises of Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, is that we view the world through a narrative lens. In 1978, Scott Peck wrote a book that became a bestseller, the road less travelled. Writing before the advent of satellite navigation systems and smartphones, he uses the analogy of the map, but what he says of the map is equally true of other navigational systems. He writes, "Our view of reality is like a map with which to negotiate the terrain of life. If the map is true and accurate, we will generally know where we are, and if we have decided where we want to go, we will generally know how to get there. If the map is false and inaccurate, we generally will be lost." Some time ago I drove to Brisbane, but the satellite navigation program in my car got me hopelessly lost because it couldn't recognise a newly constructed tunnel and freeway. So some maps and satellite navigation systems can get us lost. Likewise, not every worldview is equally liberating and life-giving. In A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking tells the story of a well-known scientist who gave a public lecture on astronomy. He explained how the Earth orbits around the Sun, and how the Sun in turn orbits around the centre of a vast collection of stars called our galaxy. At the end of the lecture, the scientist was challenged by a very confident and forthright lady. "What you have told us is rubbish. The world is really a flat plate supported on the back of a giant turtle." The scientist couldn't believe what he was hearing and did all he could to suppress a laugh. "If that is so, what is the turtle standing on?" Not to be deterred, the woman replied, "You're very clever, young man, very clever, but let me tell you, it's turtles all the way down." In telling this story, I want to make the simple point that there is no shortage of bogus worldviews. Hawking's story was about a bogus worldview of the physical universe, a flat plate supported on an infinite column of turtles. But certain ideologies are also bogus worldviews, and over time they eventually self-destruct. Consider the collapse of Soviet communism and Nazi Germany. Another bogus worldview is relativism. Pope Benedict had this to say: "We are moving toward a dictatorship of relativism, which does not recognize anything for certain, and which has as its highest goal one's own ego and one's own desires." But, of course, there is an inherent contradiction in relativism. There are no absolute truths. Is that absolutely true? Absolutely. And that response, of course, makes very clear the incoherent claims of relativism. Despite its logical incoherence, relativism runs rampant. Our culture is obsessed with freedom of choice. Whatever works for you. The technical name for this is voluntarism. Voluntarism is the view that things are true because I want them to be true. But is all truth subjective? Are all beliefs simply a matter of taste? Is religion a matter of taste? Is one religion as good as another? Are all religions really saying much the same thing? This brings us to the heart of today's Gospel. John's Gospel devotes 5 out of 21 chapters to what Jesus did and said at the Last Supper. That's approximately 1/4 of the Gospel. Today's Gospel from Jesus' farewell discourse to his disciples contains one of the most significant statements of Jesus in the Gospel. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. Philip then asked Jesus, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. And Jesus replies, Have I been with you so long, Philip, and you still do not know me? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. In these few verses of chapter 14, we have reached the high point of Johannine theology. In her commentary on John's Gospel, New Testament scholar Gail O'Day highlights the importance of what Jesus has just said. This is the heart of the good news for the Fourth Evangelist, that in Jesus, the incarnate Word, the Son of God, one can see and know God in a manner never before possible. She goes on to say, these words affirm that Jesus is the tangible presence of God in the world, and that God the Father can be known only through that incarnate presence. Humanity's encounter with Jesus the Son makes possible a new experience of God as the Father. So here we have the Christian worldview. In Jesus, God is made known. He is the unique and saving revelation of the Father, and through him alone we have access to the Father. This is a radical claim, as New Testament scholar Tom Wright points out. Within the Western world of the last 2 centuries or so, this saying of Jesus has become one of the most controversial. I am the way and the truth and the life. How dare he? People have asked. Isn't this the height of arrogance to imagine that Jesus or anyone else was the only way? I know people, professing Christians, for whom it seems that their central article of faith is their rejection of this idea of Jesus' uniqueness. The trouble with this is that it doesn't work. If you dethrone Jesus, you enthrone something or someone else instead. The belief that all religions are really the same sounds nice and democratic, though the study of religions quickly shows that it isn't true. What you are really saying if you claim that they're all the same is that none of them are more than distant echoes, distorted images of reality. You're saying that reality, God, the divine, is remote and unknowable, and that neither Jesus nor Buddha nor Moses nor Krishna gives us access to it. They all provide a way towards the foothills of the mountain, not the way to the summit. It isn't just John's Gospel that you lose if you embrace this idea. The whole New Testament, the whole of early Christianity insists that the one true and living God, the Creator, is the God of Israel, and that the God of Israel has acted decisively within history to bring Israel's story to its proper goal, and through that to address and rescue the world. In today's Gospel we hear another of Jesus' I am statements. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I spoke last Sunday about these statements in John's Gospel. The words I am translate the Greek expression ego eimi. John's Gospel uses ego eimi in 3 distinct ways. First, they are used with a predicate. So, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the true vine. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Second, the words are used without an explicit predicate, but where one may be implied. A good example occurs when the disciples are crossing the sea by night. The wind rises, the sea becomes rough, and they see Jesus walking towards them on the water. They are terrified, but Jesus says to them, "Ego eimi me phobiste." It is I, do not be afraid. On one level, these are words of reassurance. It's me, Jesus, not a ghost. Yet the scene also functions as a theophany, a moment of divine self-disclosure. And the words ego eimi carry that deeper resonance. Third, and most strikingly, John uses ego eimi without any predicate at all. For example, when Jesus says, "Before Abraham came into being, I am." Here the words stand on their own, solemn and absolute. This takes us back to Exodus chapter 3 and the burning bush. Moses asks God's name and receives the reply in Hebrew, Ehia Asher Ehia. The verb Ehia can mean I am or I will be. So the phrase is often translated I am who I am or I will be who I will be. When the scriptures were translated into Greek, this was rendered ego eimi haon. I am the one who is. John's solemn ego eimi sayings echo that divine self-revelation. They are not merely poetic metaphors, they belong to the language of revelation. So at the Last Supper, Jesus says to Thomas, I am the way, the truth, and the life. When Jesus says, I am the truth, the Greek word is aletheia. It appears 25 times in John, more than in Matthew, Mark, and Luke combined. The word suggests reality brought into the light, what is disclosed rather than concealed. Truth is reality made known. So when John says that grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, he is not claiming that Jesus offers better information about God. He is saying that in Jesus the hidden God is revealed. In John, truth is personal before it is philosophical. It is not something Jesus merely teaches. It is what he embodies. To see him is to see what God is truly like. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, aletheia often rendered the word emet, meaning faithfulness and reliability. God's truth is his steadfast fidelity. John's claim is that this faithfulness has taken flesh. The God whose truth is steadfast fidelity now stands before us in the person of Jesus. And when Jesus says, I am the life, he uses the word zoe. John distinguishes this from mere biological existence. Zoe means participation in the very life of God. Earlier in the Gospel, Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. Eternal life in John is not simply survival beyond death. It is communion with the Father through the Son, beginning now and fulfilled beyond death. To come to Jesus is not only to find direction, it is to be drawn into divine life itself. However, the key word here is way, hodos. The image of hodos is also central in the Synoptic Gospels. It appears 22 times in Matthew, 16 times in Mark, and 20 times in Luke. In Mark especially, it becomes a theological motif. The Gospel opens with Isaiah's call to prepare the way of the Lord. And from that point, Jesus is repeatedly described as being on the way, ente hodo, particularly as he moves toward Jerusalem. Along that road, he teaches about suffering, self-denial, and discipleship. The way in Mark is the way of the cross. In Matthew, hodos carries a strong moral weight. Wide is the way that leads to destruction. Narrow the way that leads to life. Here the way is a pattern of obedience, a lived response to Jesus' teaching. The way one walks reveals one's destiny. In Luke's Gospel, and continuing in Acts, the theme expands further. Luke frames Jesus' ministry as a journey to Jerusalem. On the road to Emmaus, the risen Lord walks on the way, opens the Scriptures, and is recognized in the breaking of bread. In Acts, the Christian movement itself is called the Way. To belong to Christ is to walk a path shaped by his death and resurrection. John gathers up all this imagery and intensifies it. In John chapter 14, Jesus tells the disciples, "You know the way." When Thomas objects, Jesus replies, "Ego eimi he hodos." I am the way. The shift is decisive. The way is not a teaching, not a set of instructions, not even primarily a journey. The way is a person. Access to the Father is not mapped out, but embodied. To come to the Father is to come through the Son. Where the Synoptics speak of walking a path, and Acts speaks of belonging to the way, John identifies the way entirely with Christ himself. One word the Greek New Testament uses for someone who goes ahead of others is prodromos. John's Gospel does not use this word, but we find it in the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 6, verse 20, where Jesus is described as our forerunner. Prodromos means one who goes in advance, a precursor, an advance guard. In the Roman army, the prodromoi were reconnaissance troops. They went ahead of the main body of the army to blaze the trail and to ensure that it was safe for the rest to follow. Or consider another example from the ancient world. The harbour of Alexandria in Egypt was notoriously difficult to approach. When the great grain ships arrived, a small pilot boat was sent out to meet them. It went before them and guided them safely along the narrow channel into the harbour. That pilot boat was called the prodromos. It went first so that others could follow without fear. Tom Wright offers a similar image. Imagine an explorer cutting his way deep into the jungle. Nobody has been this way before. There are no paths, no trails, no signs that it's possible to go this way. Yet on he goes, forging his way through impossible terrain until he reaches the goal. Once he's done that, others can follow. This is what the New Testament is saying about Jesus. He does not merely point out a way, he goes ahead of us through suffering, through death, through the unknown territory beyond death. He has gone first. He has opened the path to the Father. That is why, at the beginning of today's Gospel, he can say to the disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." We began with the observation that we find ourselves in a bewildering world. We look for explanations. We construct frameworks. We debate worldviews. We try to make sense of the terrain of life. But the deepest questions are not problems to be solved from the outside. They are mysteries in which we ourselves are immersed. And mysteries cannot be mastered. They can only be entered. The Christian claim is not that we have finally constructed the perfect map of reality. It is that God, who has always spoken, at the burning bush, through the prophets, and in Israel's scriptures, now speaks in a new and personal way. In Jesus Christ, the hidden God is revealed. In Jesus Christ, the way to the Father is opened. In Jesus Christ, God becomes flesh and pitches his tent among us. I am the way, not a theory, but a person. I am the truth, not speculation, but revelation. I am the life, not mere existence, but communion with the living God. And this is said not in a lecture hall, but in an upper room to frightened disciples. And so we have words of reassurance. Do not let your hearts be troubled. The world may remain bewildering. Suffering will not disappear. Mystery will not evaporate. But we are not left to wander through it alone. The road has been walked. The harbour has been entered. The Father has been made known. And so the final question is not whether the world is complex or confusing. The final question is whether we will trust the one who has gone ahead of us, the one who stands before us still and says, quietly and without apology, I am the way.